The heavy reinforced glass doors of the main facility lobby crashed open, the violent sound echoing sharply against the high concrete ceiling. "Get your stuttering, half-wit brain out of my control center." Director Harrison stood in the doorway, his $4,000 tailored suit completely untouched by the severe weather raging outside. His jaw locked. His knuckles went white against the heavy brass door handle. He pointed a manicured finger at the 68-year-old man standing on the wet tile. I just needed to show." "You don't need to show me anything." Harrison stepped forward, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the floor. "You're a mop pusher, a slow, broken, pathetic old man. You don't look at the digital monitors. You don't point your filthy fingers at the schematics, and you sure as hell don't speak in my presence unless I give you permission." "The P? Pressure valve." Harrison lunged. His large hand gripped the collar of the old man's faded yellow safety vest. The reflective fabric tore with a sharp, ugly rip. Harrison shoved him backward with his entire body weight. Elias stumbled. His worn rubber work boots lost traction on the highly polished floor. He fell backward through the open doors, his frail shoulder striking the steel frame before he crashed hard onto the rough concrete steps outside. The freezing rain hit him instantly. The thunderstorm was deafening, a massive crack of thunder shaking the massive concrete walls of the dam. Ice-cold water soaked through Elias's thin blue uniform shirt in a matter of seconds. His knees scraped against the jagged concrete, tearing the fabric of his work pants and drawing blood. He looked up, the freezing downpour washing over his deeply wrinkled face, blinking hard against the biting wind. He slowly pushed himself up to a kneeling position, his weathered hands trembling violently against the frozen ground. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to strike back. He simply reached into his chest pocket with a shaking hand and pulled out a small, waterlogged leather notebook. He held it tightly against his chest, hunching over to shield the pages from the relentless rain. Harrison stood under the dry, well-lit awning of the lobby. He looked down at the old man shivering in the mud, his expression completely flat. He pulled a white cloth handkerchief from his breast pocket and deliberately wiped a single drop of rainwater off his luxury watch. "Stay out there with the rest of the garbage." The heavy glass doors slammed shut. The magnetic security lock engaged with a heavy final click. But Director Harrison just made the biggest mistake of his entire career. He had no idea who he had just thrown into the freezing storm. He didn't know about the 1985 MIT doctorate in hydroengineering sitting in a rusted locker. He didn't know about the cavitation threshold resonance currently vibrating at 42 hertz deep underground. And he certainly had no idea that in exactly 90 minutes, he would be on his knees in this exact same mud, begging this stuttering old man to save his life. But before we get to that moment, let me take you back. Let me show you how this all started. 12 hours earlier, 2:14 a.m. The Level 4 generator room vibrated with a deep, relentless hum. Millions of gallons of river water rushed through the concrete veins of the $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure. Elias moved his push broom across the polished linoleum. Left, right, left. The rhythm was hypnotic, precise. His work boots left faint, wet outlines on the pristine floor. The rubber sole on his left boot was split entirely down the middle. Icy moisture seeped through the tier, soaking his sock with every step. He didn't adjust his gait. He didn't check his feet. He just kept sweeping. 30 feet above him, on the glass-walled command deck, the dam's modern digital mainframe bathed the room in a sterile blue glow. 3 junior engineers in crisp white collars hovered over the monitors. They tapped at screens. They trusted the digital readouts. Elias wasn't looking at the screens. He was listening to the floor. He stopped sweeping. He stood perfectly still. The acoustic vibration traveling up through the concrete wasn't smooth. It had a microscopic stutter, a faint, irregular rattle echoing from the massive penstock deep beneath them. Elias leaned his broom against the wall. He wiped his calloused hands on his faded gray overalls. He reached deep into his chest pocket. He pulled out a heavy, well-worn leather notebook. The edges were frayed smooth by decades of friction. The spine was held together by strips of black electrical tape. He opened it. The pages weren't filled with cleaning schedules. They were packed with dense, meticulously hand-drawn diagrams, advanced fluid dynamics equations, structural load stress tests. He turned to a fresh page. He pulled a 2-inch pencil stub from behind his ear. He wrote, "Penstock vibration acoustic log, cavitation threshold resonance at 42 Hz. His thumb drifted. It traced a faded, dog-eared photograph tucked into the inside flap of the leather cover. A young girl in a yellow raincoat. She had his eyes. She was pointing at a massive spillway, laughing. His throat tightened. He swallowed hard. Water always finds the truth. That was what he used to tell her, a lifetime ago. Before the accident took her, before he chose to disappear, before Dr. Elias Vance became a ghost pushing a broom. "Hey, old man!" Elias closed the notebook. One of the junior engineers leaned over the railing of the command deck. He snapped his fingers, pointing at a puddle of spilled coffee near the mainframe servers. "We got a mess down here. Clean it up." Elias slipped the heavy notebook back into his pocket. He patted it once. "Yes, sir." He picked up his yellow mop bucket. He pushed it toward the servers. The wheels squeaked over the hum of the turbines. The junior engineers turned back to their illuminated screens. "Pressure looks stable at 14.1 megapascals, the lead engineer said, sipping from a fresh mug. Elias wrung out the mop. He looked past the engineers, staring through the reinforced glass at the massive steel casing of Valve 4. His jaw locked. His knuckles went white around the wooden handle of the mop. It wasn't stable. The hydrostatic pressure was already hitting 14.2 megapascals. Thermal expansion microfractures were forming inside the steel. The computer just couldn't read the anomaly yet. Elias knew what the water was doing. He knew exactly what was coming. He looked up at the young engineers. He didn't warn them. He just lowered his head and wiped up their coffee. The observation deck of the hydroelectric facility hummed with a low, bone-deep vibration. Director Harrison stood with his back to the massive concrete wall. He checked his reflection in the reinforced glass. He adjusted the cuffs of his $4,000 Italian wool suit. 35 years old, a political appointee with zero engineering background. Behind him, the rhythmic slop of a wet mop hit the linoleum. Elias dragged the yellow bucket forward, head down, shoulders hunched in his oversized gray uniform. A junior engineer hurried onto the deck. His boots squeaked against the freshly mopped floor. He held a flashing tablet out toward Harrison. "Director, we have a problem." Harrison did not turn around. He ran a hand over his perfectly gelled hair. "The governor's helicopter lands in exactly 45 minutes. We do not have problems today. We have photo opportunities." The junior engineer stepped closer. His hand trembled. The tablet screen cast a harsh blue light across his pale face. The acoustic logs are picking up a cavitation threshold resonance. 42 hertz. It is localized near the lower penstock. Harrison finally turned. He looked at the tablet. He looked down at the engineer's work boots. Are you citing a computer glitch to me right now? It is not a glitch, sir. It is the thermal expansion microfractures we logged last month. If the tainter gates jam under 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure, the main spillway will buckle. That is 40,000 people living directly downriver. Harrison stepped into the younger man's personal space. The engineer swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. You listen to me very carefully, Harrison said. His voice dropped to a polished, threatening whisper. This is a $2.5 billion infrastructure project. The governor is cutting that ribbon today. My promotion depends on it. Your job depends on it. Harrison tapped a manicured finger against the tablet screen. I have buried 6 OSHA violations this quarter alone to keep this facility on schedule. I am not going to shut down the grid because a junior associate is afraid of a little vibration. Clear the alert. But the pressure anomaly. Clear it. The engineer lowered the tablet. His shoulders sank. He typed a command. The flashing red screen turned a placid, artificial green. He turned and walked away quickly. Harrison straightened his tie. He let out a sharp breath and turned back to the glass. 10 feet away, Elias wrung out his mop. The dirty water spiraled down into the bucket. He had heard every word. He knew exactly what a 42 hertz resonance meant. He knew the concrete was already failing. Elias did not warn them. He picked up the heavy bucket. He walked toward the exit. Harrison glanced over his shoulder. He saw nothing but a stooped, elderly janitor leaving the room. What Harrison did not know was that the microfractures in the lower penstock were already tearing the steel apart. And he had no idea that the man in the dirty gray jumpsuit was the only person alive with the clearance to save his life. The primary control center of the $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project smelled of lemon floor wax and heated server racks. 12 members of the Regional Oversight Board stood in a pristine semicircle around the central diagnostic table. Harrison adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, sweeping a laser pointer across the glowing schematics. Elias stood near the reinforced glass doors, his hands resting on the plastic handle of a yellow mop bucket. He wore faded blue coveralls, his steel-toed boots scuffed gray at the edges. He wasn't watching the presentation. His eyes were locked on a secondary analog monitor mounted in the far corner of the room. The needle on the pressure gauge was trembling. It was a subtle flutter. Elias felt it in the soles of his boots before the digital sensors caught up, a deep, rhythmic vibration echoing up from the bedrock. The cavitation threshold resonance at 42 hertz. It was a mechanical death rattle. Elias stepped forward. His rubber soles squeaked against the polished linoleum. The sound sliced through Harrison's presentation. 12 heads turned toward the door. Elias pointed a calloused finger at the corner screen. Sir. The pressure. Harrison's laser pointer clicked off. He lowered his arm. He looked at Elias's faded uniform, then at the mop bucket, and finally at Elias's face. The pressure, Harrison repeated. His voice was perfectly level, carrying the exact weight of an executive who enjoyed having an audience. Elias swallowed. 14.2 megapascals. The penstock is. Harrison stepped away from the diagnostic table. He walked across the room, his leather dress shoes clicking sharply against the floor, stopping 2 feet from where Elias stood. Are you reading the screens, Elias? Harrison asked. Elias lowered his hand. Yes, the acoustic LL log is showing. Harrison turned his back to Elias, facing the board of directors. He spread his hands, offering a tight, practiced smile. "Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse our custodial staff. He gets a little confused when the lights blink." Several board members shifted their weight. A few chuckled. Harrison turned back to Elias. He leaned in close. His voice dropped to a low, measured cadence meant to echo off the walls. "Your job is to make sure the porcelain in the executive washroom reflects my face when I look down into it. Your job is to empty the trash. Your job is not to stare at multi-million-dollar diagnostic equipment that you couldn't even begin to comprehend. Do I make myself clear?" Elias's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck tightened against his faded collar. He looked at the trembling gauge in the corner, then back to Harrison's perfectly polished shoes. He did not step back. He did not blink. "Yes, sir," Elias said. His voice was completely steady. No stutter, just quiet precision. Elias turned around, gripping the handle of the mop bucket, and pushed it through the heavy glass doors. Behind him, Harrison resumed his presentation. In the corner of the room, completely ignored, the needle on the acoustic log gauge twitched again. It inched past 42 hertz. The floor vibrated just a fraction of a millimeter harder. Section 4. Lower Spillway Catwalk. The shift supervisor didn't look up from his clipboard. He slid a standard-issue plastic mop bucket across the concrete floor. Harrison had made the call. A direct order from the climate-controlled boardroom of the $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project, straight down to the damp shadows of the custodial closet. It wasn't a reassignment. It was an execution of dignity. Elias looked down at the thin blue cotton of his uniform. The ambient temperature in the lower spillway is 34 degrees. Safety protocol requires Class 3 thermal gear. "You're a mop boy, Elias. You get a mop." The supervisor pointed his pen toward the heavy steel access door. "Mr. Harrison said you needed to cool off. You don't like it? Clock out." Elias didn't argue. His jaw shifted. He picked up the bucket by its rusted metal handle. The descent took 14 minutes, down 82 metal-grated steps into the absolute belly of the dam. The air changed immediately. It hit the back of his throat like crushed ice. The lower catwalk suspended directly over the primary outfall, a narrow strip of steel grating vibrating violently over 3 million gallons of freezing, rushing water. The physical danger was immediate. Every step Elias took sent erratic tremors through his thin rubber soles. The temperature plummeted. Condensation clung to the massive concrete walls, freezing into thin, slick sheets of black ice. He dipped the mop. The water in his bucket was already developing a crystalline crust along the edges. His hands shook. His knuckles turned a sharp, bruised purple. He gripped the wooden handle, forcing his freezing muscles to lock into place. He moved the mop across the slick steel, left, right, left. Then the metal beneath his feet shifted. Just a fraction of a millimeter, but Elias felt it. He stopped moving. He knelt on the frozen grate. He pressed his bare right palm against the icy steel girder supporting the walkway. The vibration wasn't the steady, rhythmic hum of the primary turbines. It was jagged, erratic. A penstock vibration acoustic log would show the exact frequency. Elias didn't need a computer to read it. He could feel the 42 hertz resonance traveling straight up his arm. He looked up at the massive concrete retaining wall, inches from his face. He leaned closer. There. Branching out from a rusted structural bolt were thin, jagged white lines. Thermal expansion microfractures. The structural integrity was already failing under the weight of 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure pressing against the other side. His breath plumed in the freezing air. He wiped a drop of icy water from his cheek. Harrison thought he was teaching an old man a lesson. He thought he was putting a stubborn employee in his place by freezing him half to death in the lowest sector of the facility. But what Harrison didn't know was that he had just placed the only man on Earth who understood the dam's true architectural flaws directly at ground zero. Elias didn't run. He didn't drop his mop. He reached into his breast pocket. His hands were trembling violently from the bitter cold, but he forced his fingers to close tightly around a blue ballpoint pen. He pulled out his small leather notebook. He flipped to a blank page. He started doing the math. The control room smelled of burnt ozone and stale coffee. High above the catwalk, the $50,000 digital mainframe cast a blue glow against the damp concrete wall. The pressure gauge on the primary display ticked upward. 13.9. Junior Engineer Miller adjusted his hard hat. He leaned over the main console, reaching for his clipboard to log the thermal expansion microfractures reading. As he shifted his weight, his steel-toed boot scraped against something soft on the grating. A leather notebook. It was battered, water-stained. The edges were warped from years of humidity. As Miller bent down to retrieve it, the scent of industrial bleach and floor wax hit him. It was the janitor's notebook. Elias had dropped it exactly where Harrison had grabbed him by the collar. Miller wiped a drop of condensed moisture from the worn cover. His thumb tore the edge of the brittle paper as he flipped to the inside page. He stopped walking. The page was dense with advanced fluid dynamics equations. Hand-drawn graphs mapped out cavitation threshold resonances. The ink was precise, methodical. Columns of numbers detailed the penstock vibration acoustic logs, cross-referencing variables that Miller had only seen in graduate-level textbooks. Miller pushed his safety glasses up his nose. He held the notebook up, aligning the handwritten graph with the glare of the mainframe. The digital screen flashed 14.0. Miller looked down at the open page. The ink predicted a 14.0 reading at exactly 9:14 p.m. Miller checked his watch. 9:14 p.m. His hand trembled. He turned another page. The calculations did not stop at 14.0. They extended further, predicting a sequence of thermal expansion microfractures leading directly to a 14.2 megapascal hydrostatic pressure breach. The notebook's projections were 3 steps ahead of the modern digital mainframe. Miller traced his finger along the bottom of the page. A distinct formula for 42 Hz resonance was circled twice in red ink. Beside it, a note was scribbled in sharp, authoritative handwriting. Tainter gate manual override sequence required before 14.2 megapascals. The mainframe hummed. 14.1. Miller swallowed hard. He looked at the heavy steel door leading out to the spillway. Puddles of freezing rain were still pooled on the floor where Harrison had shoved the stuttering old man out into the storm. Miller turned to the inside cover of the leather binding. 2 letters were stamped deep into the worn material, faded by time and calluses. EV. Miller raised his head. He stared at the $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure blueprint pinned to the control room wall. He looked back at the janitor's notebook. He compared the E on the paper to the E on the 1985 red-tagged structural diagrams. The handwriting matched perfectly. The pressure gauge clicked. The steel grating vibrated beneath Miller's boots. A low, grinding hum echoed from deep inside the penstock walls. 14.15. Miller dropped his clipboard. The plastic shattered against the metal floor. He ran toward the steel door, throwing his shoulder against the heavy handle. The cold wind bit into his face. He stared out into the freezing rain, scanning the dark, treacherous catwalks below. The old man with the mop was gone. The mainframe was 90 seconds away from 14.2. Rain hammered the reinforced glass of the primary observation deck, a relentless drumbeat against the 2-inch thick panes. Inside, the control room hummed with the low, steady vibration of the multi-billion-dollar mainframe. Elias stood before Terminal 4. His yellow mop bucket sat abandoned by the door. His calloused finger hovered inches from the glowing glass screen, tracing a rising red diagnostic line. The digital readout flashed 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure. The pneumatic doors hissed open. Harrison stepped through. He carried a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast. His tailored slacks were perfectly creased, a sharp contrast to the chaotic storm raging outside. He stopped halfway across the polished linoleum, his jaw locked. His knuckles went white around the handle of his mug. "Get your filthy hands off the mainframe!" Elias turned. He moved the way a river steps around a rock. He pointed a trembling, grease-stained finger back at the flashing red monitor. The C cavitation threshold resonance. It's hitting 42. Harrison crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped inches from the older man. He did not shout. He flicked his wrist. The scalding brown liquid hit Elias's faded blue work shirt with a wet slap. Ice cubes from an earlier spill melted instantly as the boiling coffee soaked through the thin cotton, burning directly into his collarbone. Steam rose from his chest, mingling with the chill of the air-conditioned room. Elias did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He reached into his deep pocket, pulled out a gray rag, and reached past Harrison to wipe a stray drop of coffee off the terminal screen. "The T-Tainter Gate Manual Override Sequence," Elias said, his voice a low gravel over the hum of the servers. "It needs to be primed." Harrison's hand shot out. His fingers coiled around the cheap nylon lanyard hanging around Elias's neck. He jerked it downward. The plastic snapped. The clip broke in two. The laminated ID badge clattered against the linoleum floor. "You don't touch the terminals. You don't speak to the engineers," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You mop the floors. But as of this exact second, you don't even do that. Get your black ass out of my facility." Harrison grabbed the collar of the soaked shirt. He twisted the fabric tight, cutting off Elias's air, and dragged the older man across the room. Elias's heavy boots dragged against the floorboards. Harrison pushed him past the glowing server racks, past the flashing pressure warnings, straight toward the rear security exit. He slammed his palm against the crash bar. The heavy steel door blew open. A violent gust of freezing rain whipped into the pristine control room, instantly soaking the floor and biting into their skin. Harrison shoved hard. Elias's boots slipped on the wet metal threshold. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing for balance, and fell out into the unforgiving night. The freezing rain swallowed him instantly. Harrison grabbed the steel handle and pulled the heavy door shut. The pneumatic seal hissed. The deadbolt engaged with a heavy metallic clank. Harrison stood by the reinforced glass, watching the dark figure fade into the torrential downpour. He brushed a stray droplet of water from his pristine cuff. His chin lifted. A slow smirk crawled across his face. He wiped his hands on his tailored slacks, turned away from the door, and walked back to his coffee maker. Harrison stood in the center of the climate-controlled command center. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored jacket. He brushed a stray drop of spilled coffee from his cuff. The reinforced security door remained sealed tight against the freezing rain outside. He exhaled a long breath, a man entirely convinced of his own superiority. Then the floor vibrated. It started deep within the concrete foundation, a low mechanical groan echoing up through the soles of his Oxford shoes. The penstock vibration acoustic log spiked across the secondary monitor. Harrison frowned. He stepped toward the primary console. A single red light blinked on the diagnostic board. Then three. Then the entire curved display flared crimson. The ambient lighting in the room snapped off. Emergency strobes washed Harrison's face in harsh red flashes. The primary readout stabilized on a single catastrophic metric, 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure. Harrison stopped breathing. He grabbed the edge of the titanium console. The metal was vibrating against his palms. The frequency was climbing fast, pushing directly toward the cavitation threshold resonance at 42 hertz. Deep beneath his feet, the sound shifted. It no longer sounded like rushing water. It sounded like tearing steel. Boiling vapor pockets were collapsing against the turbines with the force of explosives. "System stabilize," Harrison ordered. His voice cracked. He slammed his palm against the automated deployment interface. "Engage relief valves. Do it." The $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project did not listen to him. The modern digital mainframe sputtered. Lines of code cascaded across the screens in a chaotic blur. The processing units whined, overwhelmed by the catastrophic sensor failures. Then the screens went completely black. Harrison backed away. His shoulder blades hit the reinforced glass wall. His knuckles went entirely white. A single terminal flickered back to life. It did not boot the familiar graphic interface. It displayed stark white text against a black background, a remnant of the facility's original programming. Critical cavitation event detected. Digital systems locked. 6-digit architect curse, Sakinki. Harrison lunged at the keyboard. He typed his administrative password. Access denied. He typed the regional director's master key. Access denied. The vibration in the floor intensified. The coffee mug on his desk rattled, tipped, and shattered on the floor. Harrison did not even flinch. He stared at the blinking cursor. He had a master's degree in corporate management. He knew how to fire people. He knew how to manipulate quarterly budgets. He knew absolutely nothing about the thermal expansion microfractures currently tearing through the dam's foundation. He needed the code, the Tainter Gate manual override sequence, the specific numerical sequence engineered by the original architect. Harrison pulled his radio from his belt. His hands shook violently. He pressed the transmission button. "Command to engineering," Harrison choked out. "I need the manual override code now." The radio crackled. Static hissed through the room. "Engineering," Harrison screamed. He slammed his fist into the console. The plastic casing cracked. The flashing prompt on the screen did not change. The pressure gauge ticked higher. Harrison stared at the 6 empty brackets. The temperature in the room was 72 degrees, but sweat poured down his neck, ruining his expensive collar. He was trapped in a sealed room with a collapsing system he did not understand. The man in charge had absolutely no idea what to do. The primary console cast a strobing crimson glare across the command center. The digital readouts locked at 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure. The steel floor plates vibrated up through their boots, a deep, bone-rattling hum. Cavitation threshold resonance at 42 hertz. Harrison stood paralyzed by the main terminal. His arms hung limply at his sides. Davis, a junior structural tech, backed away from the unresponsive digital mainframe. His chest heaved against his uniform shirt. He spun away from Harrison and scrambled toward the emergency fire safe, built into the far wall. His hands shook violently as he manipulated the brass dial. He threw his body weight against the handle, wrenching the heavy steel door open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, dust-covered cylinder, a red-tagged blueprint tube from 1985. The original foundation documents for the $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project. Davis carried the tube to the central drafting table. He uncapped it and unrolled the massive yellowed parchment under the flickering overhead halogens. He flattened the curling edges down with both forearms. His eyes darted across the faded schematic lines. He scanned the margins, desperate for a manual bypass valve configuration. His gaze snagged on the bottom right corner. The original architect's handwritten notation. Sharp, distinct, aggressively angled lettering, detailing the structural load limits. Davis stopped breathing. He turned his head slowly toward the floor near the shattered exit door. Elias's battered leather notebook lay open against the baseboard, pages fluttering slightly from the draft. Harrison had kicked it into the corner just minutes ago. Davis crept across the vibrating floor. He crouched. He picked up the notebook. He carried the worn leather book back to the drafting table. He laid it flat directly beside the 1985 foundation blueprint. He looked down at the notebook's open page. It displayed a flawless hand-drawn diagram of the exact turbine housing that was currently failing. The margins were completely filled with advanced fluid dynamics equations. He looked at the blueprint. He looked back at the notebook. The handwriting on the 40-year-old architectural schematic. The handwriting in the stuttering coffee boy's battered notebook. The sharp slashing crosses on the T's. The aggressively hooked loops on the Y's. The precise, microscopic numerical fractions. A perfect, undeniable match. Davis's throat convulsed. He swallowed hard. His mind flashed to the massive bronze dedication plaque bolted to the main lobby wall downstairs. The plaque praising the unparalleled genius of the original architect. The plaque signed only with two deeply engraved initials. E.V. Davis dragged a trembling index finger across the faded black ink on the blueprint, then across the fresh blue ink in the notebook. He looked up at the reinforced glass doors, leading out into the freezing rain. The exact doors Harrison had just violently shoved the old man through. Davis's knees buckled. He gripped the sharp metal edge of the drafting table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. The floor grumbled under Harrison's expensive leather shoes. The monitors above the main console bathed the room in a pulsing, crimson glare, flashing warnings of a cavitation threshold resonance at 42 hertz. The sound of water hammering against the concrete walls sounded like artillery fire. Then a harsh analog ring cut through the alarm klaxons. The heavy red phone bolted to the center of the command desk flashed. It was the secure line. Harrison wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. He snatched the receiver, pressing a button to put it on the room's loudspeaker. "Harrison, Regional Director," he said, his posture rigidly straight. "We are currently holding back 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure. We have the situation under." Listen to me very carefully, Director. The voice on the speakerphone was sharp and clipped. This is the governor's emergency liaison. Your digital mainframe is entirely locked out. Our sensors are picking up thermal expansion microfractures across the primary spillway. Harrison's fingers tightened around the plastic handset. I am aware of the data. My engineers are running the diagnostics too. You are out of time, Director, the liaison snapped. This is a $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project, and it is 3 minutes away from complete structural failure. There is only one man with Federal Emergency Management Agency Tier 1 clearance authorized to execute the Tainter Gate manual override sequence. Harrison swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. I need Dr. Elias Vance on this line, the liaison demanded. Now. Harrison blinked. He looked across the glowing control deck toward Davis. Davis stood paralyzed, his hands trembling as he clutched the weathered leather notebook. There! Harrison's throat clicked. There is no Dr. Vance on my staff. He is not on your payroll, Harrison. Dr. Vance designed that facility. He has been monitoring the penstock vibration, acoustic logs on site for the last 4 years under a civilian maintenance cover. Davis moved, his shoes dragged against the tile. He set the leather notebook down on the illuminated glass of the central console. Beside it, he unrolled the heavy parchment from the red-tagged blueprint tube from 1985. He slid both items toward Harrison. The faded initials on the leather cover, EV, sat perfectly aligned with the crisp, unmistakable signature at the bottom of the master blueprints. Harrison stared at the matching handwriting. His jaw slacked. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his face the shade of wet ash. His eyes drifted away from the blueprints, moving slowly toward the heavy steel security door at the back of the room. The door he had bolted shut from the inside. The door leading out into the freezing, sleet-filled storm. Director, the liaison's voice barked through the speaker. Put Dr. Vance on the line. Harrison's knees gave out. He caught himself on the edge of the console. His knuckles went entirely white against the metal trim. His chest hitched as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The plastic phone receiver slipped from his loosened grip. It plummeted off the desk, dangling by its coiled black cord, swinging back and forth, thudding against the steel cabinet. He had grabbed the old man by the collar of his faded uniform. He had shoved him backward into the mud. He had locked him out in the ice. Harrison stared at the swinging phone. His lips parted, but his vocal cords refused to move. Harrison! The liaison shouted from the dangling receiver. Where is Dr. Vance? The heavy plastic receiver of the emergency line slipped from Harrison's grip. It struck the master console with a sharp crack, tumbling over the edge to dangle by its coiled cord. It swung back and forth, rhythmically tapping against the brushed steel cabinet. Harrison's hand remained suspended in the air. His fingers were still curved around a phone that was no longer there. The tips of his fingers turned completely numb. A cold, prickling sweat broke across the back of his neck, soaking the crisp collar of his custom-tailored shirt. The blood drained from his face in a slow, agonizing wave. His cheeks, usually flushed with the perpetual heat of his own absolute authority, turned the color of wet ash. Beneath his expensive leather shoes, the floor vibrated. A low, relentless thrumming traveled through the soles of his feet and up his spine. 42 hertz. The cavitation threshold resonance. The entire $2.5 billion concrete structure was humming. A physical manifestation of the disaster tearing through the foundation. Harrison's jaw came completely unhinged. The arrogant lock of his chin vanished. His mouth hung open. His lips moved, pressing together and pulling apart, but his throat refused to work. His chest hitched, pulling in a shallow, ragged breath that sounded like tearing paper. He tried to shift his weight. His right knee buckled instantly. He collapsed forward, catching himself heavily against the edge of the master control panel. His fingernails scraped violently across the metal. His knuckles went stark, bone white as he gripped the ledge, barely keeping himself from hitting the floor. His head turned slowly, agonizingly, toward the corridor, toward the reinforced security door at the end of the hall. The heavy steel door, the one he had just slammed, the one he had locked. Through the thick, reinforced observation window, the storm raged. Freezing rain lashed against the glass in violent, diagonal sheets, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the pane. The wind howled, a low, mechanical shriek that pierced straight through the thick concrete walls. Harrison stared at the electronic deadbolt. The small LED indicator glowed a solid, unforgiving red. On the desk beside him, the red-tagged blueprint tube from 1985 sat perfectly still under the flickering fluorescent lights. The console behind Harrison blared, a high-pitched, relentless warning klaxon. The main screen flashed crimson, bathing Harrison's pale face in a harsh, pulsing red light. 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure pressing against the primary spillway. Harrison's hand shook. The tremor started in his fingers and vibrated all the way up his arm to his shoulder. He looked down at his own hand, watching it shake uncontrollably as if it belonged to someone else. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed heavily in his throat. He had to unlock the door. He had to step out into the freezing storm, into the mud and the ice. He had to find the elderly maintenance worker he had just physically dragged by the collar and thrown into the rain. He had to look that man in the eyes, and he had to beg him for the Tainter Gate manual override sequence. Harrison pushed his weight off the console. His legs moved like they were submerged in wet cement. He dragged his feet across the vibrating floor, his wide eyes completely fixed on the red LED of the heavy steel door. The steel door of the control center slammed open. The wind immediately grabbed it, tearing the handle from Harrison's grip and slamming it against the exterior concrete wall. Freezing rain came sideways. It hit Harrison's face like shattered glass. Within 3 seconds, his $4,000 tailored wool suit was plastered to his skin, heavy and useless. He stumbled down the metal-grated stairs, his leather shoes slipping on the wet steel. He fell to his knees on the landing, tearing the fabric of his trousers, scraping his skin against the grating. He didn't stop. He scrambled up, pushing through the deluge. The dam groaned. A deep, bone-rattling vibration translated through the concrete walkway directly into the soles of his feet. The cavitation threshold resonance at 42 Hz was tearing the structure apart from the inside. He found him 50 yards away. Elias was sitting on a rusted toolbox beneath a concrete overhang, sheltered from the worst of the storm. He wasn't shivering. His hands rested flat on his knees. His soaked uniform clung to his frame, but his posture was completely straight. Harrison staggered into the shelter of the overhang. His chest heaved. Water poured down his face, mixing with sweat. He stared at the elderly maintenance worker, the man he had ordered dragged out of the building by security just 20 minutes ago. Harrison's knees buckled. He collapsed into the thick, freezing mud at Elias's feet. The expensive wool suit absorbed the brown sludge. He looked up at the old man. Elias looked down at him. His facial muscles did not twitch. The mainframe. Harrison's voice cracked. He gasped for air. It locked down. The Taintergate manual override sequence. They, the governor's office. They said. Harrison's swallowed hard. His hands shook as he pressed them deep into the mud to keep himself upright. They said Dr. Vance. Harrison stared at the faded initials on Elias's uniform shirt. EV, please. Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, waterproof flashlight. He turned it over in his hands, wiping a single drop of water from the lens with his thumb. The pressure. Harrison's voice was a ragged whisper. 14.2 megapascals. The thermal expansion microfractures. They're spreading. We're going to lose the primary spillway. Please. I'll do anything. Harrison pressed his forehead toward the mud, his shoulders shaking. I was wrong. I was so arrogant. Please, Dr. Vance, save us. The vibration in the concrete spiked. A sickening crack echoed from the penstock housing deep within the facility. Elias stood up. He didn't look at Harrison. He looked past him, toward the massive concrete face of the dam, reading the vibrations through the soles of his boots. When Elias spoke, the hesitant, broken rhythm of the coffee boy was entirely gone. His voice was a flat, resonant baritone that cut straight through the howling wind. The secondary hydraulic lines will fail in exactly 4 minutes. Elias adjusted his collar. Get off your knees, Mr. Harrison. You're blocking my path to the control room. Harrison remained in the mud, staring up at the man who held a 1985 MIT doctorate in hydroengineering, a FEMA Tier 1 clearance, and the lives of 200,000 people in his hands. Elias stepped around the kneeling executive. Follow my exact orders from this second forward, Elias said, not looking back, or I will leave you out here. Harrison scrambled to his feet, slipping in the mud, and chased after the janitor. Water pooled on the linoleum tiles. Elias Vance stepped through the reinforced steel doors of the control center. Mud caked his steel-toed boots, leaving heavy, dark tracks across the pristine floor. Freezing rainwater dripped from his jaw, soaking into the collar of his frayed maintenance jacket. Harrison stumbled in, seconds later. The executive's custom-tailored suit clung to his shivering frame, heavy with the freezing mud of the spillway bank. Harrison reached out a trembling, pale hand, his chest heaving. Elias did not look at him. He walked past the executive the way a man walks past a broken chair. The control room bathed the pale crew in flashing crimson light. The steel floor plates vibrated underfoot. The penstock vibration acoustic log spiked violently across the main display, charting a direct course toward a catastrophic rupture. Elias stopped in front of the primary terminal. He pulled a grease-stained rag from his pocket, methodically wiped the rainwater from his calloused hands, and placed the rag on the console. The junior engineers instinctively backed away. They watched the maintenance man's fingers hover over the illuminated keyboard. 6 rapid keystrokes. A heavy, metallic clack echoed from the server rack. The flashing red lockdown screens snapped into a steady, operational blue. Elias gripped the edge of the console. He stared at the rushing stream of telemetry data. Route auxiliary flow to bypass channels 3 and 4. Initiate the Taintergate manual override sequence. The engineers froze, not a single stutter. The stumbling, broken rhythm of the coffee boy had vanished completely. His voice carried the sharp, absolute weight of a man holding Federal Emergency Management Agency Tier 1 clearance. Sir, a young technician swallowed hard. The cavitation threshold resonance at 42 Hz. The original mix can take it, Elias commanded, his eyes locked on the pressure readings. Drop the grid load by 30%. Vent the upper chambers before the thermal expansion microfractures reach the secondary containment wall. Execute. The technician's hands flew across the auxiliary board. Deep within the concrete belly of the $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project, massive hydraulic gears ground into motion. The floor stopped shuddering. The deafening blare of the proximity alarms cut off mid-scream. On the central monitor, the hydrostatic pressure gauges dropped from a critical 14.2 megapascals down to a stable green 8. The low, rhythmic hum of the safe turbines vibrated gently through the floorboards. Harrison leaned against the steel doorframe. His legs gave out. He slid down the wall until his knees hit the wet linoleum, his hands gripping his mud-stained lapels. His jaw hung open. He stared at the back of the maintenance man's faded jacket. Elias pulled a red-tagged blueprint tube from 1985 out of his locker. He unrolled it across the primary console, smoothing the edges with his palm. He did not look back at the door. The alarm klaxons cut off abruptly, leaving only the heavy, rhythmic hum of the cooling fans. Elias Vance didn't look at Harrison. He unrolled a red-tagged blueprint tube from 1985, laying it flat across the primary console. He traced a grease-stained finger along the faded schematic. Heavy footsteps pounded up the metal grating of the access stairs. 2 state troopers and a federal agent in a nylon windbreaker stepped into the control room. "Dr. Vance," the agent asked, his hand resting on his belt. Elias didn't look up from the readouts. "The hydrostatic pressure is stable at 14.2 megapascals. The cavitation threshold resonance held at 42 Hz. I've engaged the Tainter Gate manual override sequence." He tapped a stack of dot matrix printouts. The penstock vibration acoustic log shows thermal expansion microfractures. It's contained. He finally turned, pointing a finger at Harrison. "Take him." Harrison's jaw dropped. He backed into the server rack, his hands coming up to his chest, palms facing outward. "Wait, my uncle is." "You're being charged with criminal negligence on a $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project," the agent said, stepping forward. "Dr. Vance holds Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Tier 1 clearance. You do not." The handcuffs ratcheted shut, the metal teeth biting into Harrison's wrists. He dropped to his knees on the steel grate. His designer slacks soaked up a puddle of hydraulic fluid. Elias adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, turning his back to the man completely. Down in the lower communications bay, a junior engineer watched the raw security feed. On the high-resolution monitor, tears streaked through the grease on Harrison's face as he knelt in the puddle of fluid, his hands reaching toward the troopers. The engineer's fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. He tapped a sequence of keys. A green progress bar filled the monitor. The file bypassed the internal servers, transferring directly to an external host. Millions of pixels rearranged themselves on screens across the country. The footage spread. The comments multiplied. The name Harrison flooded the network. In a mahogany-paneled boardroom 40 miles away, a heavy glass door swung open. 3 men in tailored suits walked in. Harrison's uncle sat at the head of the long table, a crystal glass halfway to his mouth. The glass hovered. "The emergency board meeting has concluded," the lead man said. He placed a single sheet of paper on the polished wood. "Your access codes have been revoked." The CEO's hand trembled. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Amber liquid pooled around his leather wingtips. He looked down at the paper. The termination text filled a single paragraph. He stood up, his knees shaking, and walked out of the room, leaving his leather briefcase sitting on the table. The federal courtroom smelled of floor wax and old paper. The judge adjusted her microphone, the sound scratching through the speakers. Harrison stood at the defense table. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles stark white. His throat clicked audibly as he swallowed. 15 years, the judge said. Her gavel struck the wooden block. Harrison's knees buckled. He collapsed back into his wooden chair, his chest heaving. The bailiff stepped forward, grabbing his shoulder. In the back row of the gallery, Elias Vance sat with his hands folded over his lap. He wore a clean, pressed suit. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply watched the bailiff drag Harrison through the side door. The heavy oak door shut. Elias stood up, smoothed his tie, and walked out into the sunlight. The steel grating vibrated against the soles of Elias's work boots. 42 hertz. The cavitation threshold resonance held steady beneath his feet. He leaned against the yellow safety railing. Looking down into the massive spillway, 14.2 megapascals of hydrostatic pressure pushed against the concrete wall, but the penstock vibration acoustic logs read perfectly flat. The water churned in a controlled rhythmic hum. He raised a styrofoam cup to his mouth. Steam drifted from the black liquid. He took a sip. It tasted like burnt copper and ash, the exact same breakroom coffee he had been drinking 3 weeks ago. He looked up toward the main observation deck. The old administration banner was gone. In its place, bolted directly into the load-bearing concrete, rested a massive new bronze dedication plaque. The morning sun hit the polished metal, tracing the deep grooves of the lettering. The Sarah Vance Hydroelectric Facility, dedicated to the architect's greatest inspiration. Footsteps echoed on the steel catwalk. A junior engineer approached, his hard hat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The young man stopped exactly 3 feet away. He kept his chin tucked, lowering his tablet. "Director Vance," the engineer said. "The red-tagged blueprint tubes from 1985 are secured in the primary vault. We updated the Taintergate manual override sequence. Federal Emergency Management Agency Tier 1 clearance protocols are fully active." Elias took another sip of his coffee. He set the styrofoam cup on the railing, keeping his eyes on the churning water below. "Log the thermal expansion microfractures. Brief me at noon." The engineer nodded once. He stepped backward, turned, and walked briskly back toward the control center. Elias turned his attention back to the turbines. He wore the exact same faded gray hoodie, the same scuffed heavy boots. He drank the exact same cheap coffee, but the $2.5 billion hydroelectric infrastructure project hummed to his exact specifications. The man who had been violently thrown out into the freezing rain now commanded the regional grid for 3 entire states. The stutter was completely gone. The architect had reclaimed his house. Power is a strange thing. People assume it wears a tailored suit and demands a corner office. They assume it yells, threatens, and throws its weight around. They forget that absolute power doesn't need to announce itself. Absolute power can afford to wear scuffed boots and sip terrible coffee, waiting patiently for the exact moment the math proves everyone else wrong. The next time you look past someone because their clothes are worn or their voice is quiet, ask yourself, do you really know who you are standing next to?